Wonderful programs. A brief note about the context for tonight. So by context, I'm going to address space and time. Space, some of you said, well, I haven't been in this sanctuary in a long time. Well, neither had I. Saturday night was the first time in almost 3 years that I've been in this sanctuary. So we are so grateful that we are here now, and grateful to you for coming, and grateful to the folks on Zoom for joining us. And we also want to acknowledge this beautiful place is on the unceded land of the Haudenosaunee people that we speak of as have formerly called the Iroquois. And so we want to acknowledge that. And we know in connection with that, then in a couple of weeks, we'll be celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. And we have a subgroup of the Social Action Committee that is exploring and supporting Indigenous peoples issues. So that's the space context. The time context, I want to acknowledge that this is a time of beginnings and endings. For Jennifer and Simeon, what a momentous time. And special thanks to you for being willing to come to us at a time that has to be so exciting and challenging for both of you, and when you have just had your major gala event over the weekend, which is hard to imagine. They were doing that and then coming here. So as you'll hear in a moment that Jennifer is stepping down as President and CEO of the Rochester Area Community Foundation, which she has brilliantly led for the last 33 years. And Simeon Bannister is stepping up as the President and CEO of that magnificent organization. So for them, it's a transition moment. And for us as Jews, it's a moment of transition as we are leading up to the high holidays. And so it's a time where we communally and individually examine where we have missed the mark. And we are called to return. It's called teshuvah, to return to who we really are, to return to who we are, to our best selves. And while we ask for forgiveness from God and again for sins against God, it is for human beings that we have harmed that we ask forgiveness from them. And then not only to ask forgiveness, but to take action to make it right. And so this new year gives us an opportunity to begin again and to heed the call to tikkun olam, to heal the world. And this week, in terms of timing, the Ken Burns PBS special documentary on the US and the Holocaust offers us yet another context, a cautionary tale for looking at how injustices and inequities threaten democracy. So before I introduce our speakers, a few housekeeping notes. Those on Zoom, please mute. You won't actually need to be unmuted at all because you can put any questions that you have in the chat. And you know the chat at the bottom of the screen. And you can send a chat to everyone. And Joni will be receiving those and putting them together with any questions that the audience here has put on cards. So I think, yeah, I don't know whether anybody, we have what somebody said is an exciting announcement because we haven't had to have this announcement before. If you're looking for the men's and women's rooms, you go down the aisle right at the back of this, and you go straight down into make a left turn to get to the men's room on the right and go straight down longer and you will see the women's room on the left. It's a joy to have to make that announcement. Previous speakers in this series were eminent national figures. Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter David K. Johnston kicked it off. He's a good friend of one of our speakers. And the founder and director of the National Coalition Building Institute, NCBI, Sherry Brown, and the co-author of Four Threats to Democracy, Robert Lieberman. Tonight's speakers are locally based and no less eminent. As president and CEO of the Rochester Area Community Foundation, Jennifer Leonard has worked for 33 years with philanthropists and community partners to strengthen our 8-county region. The Community Foundation's broad goals are creating an equitable community and strengthening our region's vitality. Thank you, Jennifer. Since Jennifer assumed her position in 1993, the Community Foundation has grown more than, get this, 18-fold to $598 million. The foundation distributed $48 million in grants and scholarships last year. It is one of the top community foundations in the nation. Maybe the top, I don't know. There are communities that have more money than we do. The New York Attorney General appointed Jennifer to the leadership committee that shaped a 2013 overhaul of the state's nonprofit laws. Her leadership in the national world of philanthropy has been widely recognized. She is seen as a leader of leaders. She will be, while she's been engaged in high-level national and statewide endeavors, she's had her boots on the ground in Rochester as well. Award after award, including the Athena Award and many others, and list after list have cited Jennifer's impact on our local community. She will be retiring in 11 days, but who's counting? I think I'm right. How blessed our community has been that she and her husband, David K. Johnston, her good friend and her husband, landed and stayed in Rochester. We wish you the very best, Jennifer. Simeon Bannister, the incoming president and CEO of RACF, is a dynamic, sought-after speaker, and you will see why shortly. Most recently, he's been speaking on Rochester's history of redlining and racial inequities. For several years, he's been president of the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and those of us who've been fortunate enough to be present all these years at the annual commemoration have been thrilled to see this dynamic man continue to grow and flourish and inspire us. He joined RACF as Vice President of Community Programs in 2017 when he managed the area responsible for the foundation's grant making and community engagement. Most recently, he's been the Transitional Executive Vice President. Isn't that, I love that. Transitional Executive Vice President for a year. What good thinking. In preparation to assume the position of President and CEO in October. He serves on the boards of the University of Rochester Medical Center, the Congressional Award Foundation, the Children's Agenda, the Genesee Land Trust, former member of the Russian Henrietta Board of Education. His career spans across public and private sectors, including the New York Senate. He worked for the New York Senate, the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, the State University of New York, and several private commercial real estate firms. Simeon earned his undergraduate degree in political science at North Carolina Central University and his Master of Divinity, can't wait to see it up here, from Princeton Theological Seminary. Their plan for tonight is for Jennifer to speak. Simeon will briefly reflect on her speech and then offer his thoughts, to which Jennifer will respond. They're going to do a little choreography, a dance here. And then we'll take a quick breath while the question cards are collected. Jennifer and Simeon, welcome.
Good evening. I want to start by thanking Temple Sinai for the opportunity to share my thoughts about inequities and democracy in Rochester and beyond. And thank you so much for the honor of being able to speak in this sacred and beautiful space. I didn't tell my husband. I understand he would have liked to be here too. So we'll leave that. I want to say from the beginning that the Community Foundation's recent work has been focused on inequities faced by African Americans and Latinos in Rochester. However, as an organization founded by members of the Jewish community, we are highly aware of the injustice of anti-Semitism and want to acknowledge it here in your special sanctuary. Many of the lessons we've learned about race and connection apply equally to anti-Semitism. In 1993, I was a newcomer to Rochester. Longtime Mayor Tom Ryan was preparing to step down. A large slate of candidates vied to become his successor, including City Council President Ruth Scott, who stepped down from being the Community Foundation's first African-American board chair to run for mayor. As the first Black female to serve on City Council, as well as its president, Ruth had a deep understanding of city government and a good case for support. But she recalls that when she was campaigning, she pushed open a door to a bar and was confronted by an angry male customer, white, who demanded to know who she thought she was running for mayor. Much of the racism I've found in Rochester was more subtle, coming from years in big cities like Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Philadelphia. I was personally shocked to see no Black servers in restaurants. Our then United Way director, Joe Calabrese, told me that was just the way of it. When house hunting, I asked to see communities that were diverse and had good schools, but was told they don't exist. The same situation prevailed in hiring. Though our board had had diverse members from its founding 50 years ago yesterday, on my arrival, the Community Foundation had only recently hired its first staff member of color, our receptionist and later grant administrator, Lenny Manis. My predecessor had faced pressure to hire a staff member of color from board members like Mary Frances Winters, now one of the nation's top diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, and still a foundation donor, though she has moved away from here. It was Mary Frances, incidentally, who encouraged me to run for the position of president and CEO of the Community Foundation. Years later, Democrat and Chronicle reporter Diana Louise Carter pitched her editors on a story covering diversity in small and medium-sized businesses. Then she struck out trying to find examples. She told us, the Community Foundation, we were the only organization that seemed to fit the story's premise, as we had continued to hire additional staff members of color as we grew and engaged in diversity training to help make it work. We had had the advantage, though, of Ford Foundation grant funding called Diverse Communities, Diverse Community Foundations, which had us inspect the diversity of our grantees, vendors, and volunteers, in addition to our board and staff. It has been a great example of good philanthropy, in this case, the Ford Foundation's, having lasting benefits. And if you look around at the people we employ, when you're at an event of ours or in other ways, you'll see that we have carried on the diversification of where we put our dollars. I don't tell that story to pat ourselves on the back, but to explain that the inequities in Greater Rochester are deeply embedded in culture and practice. The Community Foundation's research on racial attitudes, connections between people, and participation in civic life consistently reflect this. A great deal of the human perspective here results from the segregated lives of our neighbors, a long history of white flight and business relocations to the suburbs, followed by increasingly concentrated poverty in the city, declining educational outcomes, and periodic surges in crime born of hopelessness. In our last high crime period in the early 1990s, our city government responded with neighbors building neighborhoods, which strengthened self-governance across the city's block clubs, neighborhood associations, and new sectors that were given a role in the distribution of civic dollars. Neighbors Building Neighborhoods was the brainchild of Rochester Mayor Bill Johnson, our first African-American mayor, and particularly Community Development Commissioner Tom Argist, a former community organizer and previous board president of the Community Foundation. The Community Foundation's relatively modest neighborhood grants complemented Neighbors Building Neighborhoods, or NBN as it was called, and we helped the city develop its larger grant-making program in the new sectors. NBN went on to attract many national awards. Mayor Johnson understood that the fortunes of our city residents were often of little import to those commuting into their jobs on federally funded highways. So when he created a stewardship council for this first comprehensive city plan in many years, he included people from the adjoining counties as well as suburban and rural Monroe County residents. Bill also saw that people who didn't know each other would have little understanding of what needed to be faced and addressed. So he created a commission on race chaired by Sankofa, Dr. David Anderson. The commission called on Bob Rosenfeld, a creativity and diversity consultant, to help create a solution. Together, they built a biracial partnerships program that connected Rochester's top leaders across race in a year-long facilitated program. Some 180 local leaders, including me, were paired up to participate in that first edition of this experiment to foster friendships and understanding across difference. We were each chosen because we were similar to our partner, except in racial or ethnic identity. It had some very positive effects, and you may know this story. For example, Danny Wegman and then City Council leader Wade Norwood were partners. Danny later supported Wade's race for mayor. Wade is now CEO of Common Ground Health. Then RIT President Al Simone partnered with the late Ibero-American Action League VP and later City Council President Gladys Santiago, and that led RIT to some of the deepest diversity work of any local university. And then Brighton supervisor Sandy Frankel and University of Rochester Medical Center Assistant Dean Dr. Brenda Lee, now retired, became fast friends, as did their families, and went on vacations together. Mayor Johnson's biracial partnerships program ultimately ran 5 times, including one edition after 9/11 that connected people across religion. Subsequent administrations unfortunately let the program lapse. They had other priorities. The community program helps support a nonprofit called Odyssey of Humanity to continue the program, but it ultimately shut down. Later, the Community Foundation invested in Rochester's YWCA to develop and launch another connection program called Person to Person, now inactive. We continue to encourage other efforts to reconnect our community, so you are hereby invited to think things through. Why focus on connection? Well, as I suggested earlier, when you live, work, and go to school separately, you have no investment in or understanding of the other. In the year 2000, the Community Foundation worked with Harvard and 35 other foundations on the first ever National Community Social Capital Benchmark Survey, examining the interconnectedness of people. The Community Foundation oversampled to be sure we understood the differences among white, Black, and Latino Rochesterians. Overall, Rochester showed up as highly trusting and tolerant compared to the rest of the country. However, when we examined the results by race, geography, education, income, and even religion, the results were starkly different. If you lived in the suburbs, had a good income and education, and were white, you were off the charts in feelings of well-being, connection to others, and especially trust. But if you lived in the city of Rochester and were Black or Latino, you trusted few people, not the folks where you lived, not where you shopped, where you worked, not even your co-congregants. You also didn't volunteer much because you didn't feel welcome. We said, this is not good, and founded ACT Rochester, a community indicators program to further understand at a local level the data that could drive our region's decision-making. Interestingly, speaking of information, our new ACT Rochester director, a PhD sociologist named Dr. Megan Norris, tells me that a different interpretation of the term social capital is focused less on interconnectedness and more on what we have as individuals to be able to make those connections, like having information. Information is a useful form of personal capital. Isn't that an interesting idea? So you may see some of that from ACT Rochester because Meg's in charge now. ACT Rochester's initial and continuing research on local inequities showed that Black and brown residents across our entire region, not just the city of Rochester, were 3 to 4 times more likely to live in poverty. We found that differences we ascribed to race were highly correlated with poverty, lower rates of education, lower income, and higher death rates. A 17-year difference in when you could expect on average to die if you were a Black Rochesterian compared to a white one. 17 years. We felt that personally as our beloved Lenny Manis died. I'm gonna pretend to take this for my cough, but actually it's because I'm choking up. Excuse me. Our beloved Lenny Manis died well before her retirement age, and so did our colleague Betty Rainey, a superb scholarship manager, and the person who first taught me about homegoing to see Ghana and Senegal, and the African kingdoms and slave forts that launched 4 centuries of American oppression through slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and discrimination. We have known for decades that white Americans would be outnumbered by racially and ethnically diverse Americans by the mid-21st century. There's no surprise there. The right-leaning Heritage Foundation started flagging those projections in the 1980s, if not earlier. Those who worried about this, rather than planning for our mutual success, have tried to undo the civil rights gains of the 60s, reinstating, and you know this, reinstating voting restrictions, reducing census funding, rigging voting district boundaries to reduce minority power, and most recently, flagrantly trying to upend the results of elections. I don't know about you, but the news this weekend that major Republican candidates across the country refused to promise to accept the results of their elections was bone-chilling. How about our city residents of color? In the face of working 3 jobs, facing daily microaggressions, and enduring health challenges, those who suffer inequities and injustices can hardly prioritize voting and participation in the democratic process. But there are some gains. The Community Foundation helped fund the Latino Campaign Academy in the early 2000s as part of our civic engagement grants, those connection grants I was describing. It led to a number of Hispanic candidates from different political parties. That was the connecting across difference that we insisted on in those grants. In 2020, Miguel Melendez of Ibero-American Action League and now City Council President worked with the Community Foundation, Common Ground Health, the Greater Rochester Health Foundation, and the City of Rochester to secure the All-America City Award for Rochester based on each organization's community-based work and the City of Rochester's overall commitment to diversity. Rochester was named an All-America City because we showed how deliberately diversifying efforts and including local residents led to far better results in building neighborhoods. That would be Project Hope in the El Camino neighborhood, reducing student suspensions, the Community Task Force on School Climate, and combating high blood pressure, the High Blood Pressure Coalition. Did you hear about our becoming an All-America City? No, and for a sad reason. By the time it was announced, Daniel Prude had died, George Floyd had died, Breonna Taylor had died, and the pandemic raised too many other issues, including continued disparities in services and outcomes for persons of color right here. So the city shelved our recognition, and though it is still active for 3 more years, if anyone wants to work to bring it out. Today in Rochester, it's still hard to buy a house. It's still harder to buy a house if you're Black, to find a good public education, particularly in the city, though the options are growing. It's hard to live near in better school districts, again, because of housing issues and the lack of affordable housing and the zoning requirements in many of those suburbs. It's hard to be recognized for your accomplishments and talents, and most importantly, to be welcomed socially into jobs and into civic life. There are encouraging efforts, though, to address this, including work by the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors, the Urban League's Interrupt Racism, which follows early work by Facing Race, Embracing Equity, or FREE. Some of you were involved in that. The Racial Equity and Justice Initiative, and Exploring Racism Groups, which educates and empowers local leaders on matters of race. The Community Foundation received encouraging news from our most recent triennial survey on racial attitudes in Monroe County, conducted by the Siena College Research Institute since 2012 in partnership with the Democrat and Chronicle. I am pleased to say that there has been a notable increase over the last 10 years in the awareness by Monroe County residents of racism and its corrosive effects, and also greater commitment by up to 3/4 of our respondents to supporting efforts that address inequities socially, economically, and educationally. I invite every white person in Rochester to help by becoming more aware of our communities and our country's racial history, more sensitive to the embedded racism that triggers unconscious bias in us all, more committed to acting deliberately to deconstruct our segregated community, and to stop overlooking the bigotry of other individuals and institutions. To learn more, you can download our hard facts reports on race at actrochester.org. Now, I am delighted that our board of directors agreed with my judgment that Simeon Bannister would be the ideal candidate to replace me at the Community Foundation, and you'll see why. Simeon, take it away.
All right, we're going to try to use some technology tonight and see if this works. First, let me just echo the comments that were made earlier about this wonderful space that is teeming with life. And I want to think about this idea of teeming with life in the juxtaposition to much of what we've experienced for the last few years. A time that has felt at moments very dark, and very difficult, and very challenging. I won't speak for anybody else, our friends online notwithstanding, but it feels good to be off the Zoom and to be in the room. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'll take a couple of minutes and respond to Jennifer's opening and then share a few thoughts about my own take on our topic for this evening. In responding to Jennifer's comments, I'd like to do something that will probably mortify her, but I think is absolutely appropriate given the moment and given the time. There's a quote from Lao Tzu that says that a leader is best when people barely know her work exists. When her work is done, her aim fulfilled, they will say, we did it ourselves. I don't know if you were listening closely, but as Jennifer was describing all of the work that has happened over the 30 years of her tenure, I didn't hear very many I's. I didn't hear very many me's. I didn't hear about how she invented, she created, she started, she led, but over and over in her comments, what we heard was the opportunity to lift other people up, to highlight their work. I want to think about what it means to increase a foundation, as you heard earlier, 18-fold, from $32 million when she started at RACF to $598 million today. There are a lot of people that would say that it is not possible to raise those kinds of dollars and talk in Rochester, New York about racial equity, but Jennifer did. And to me, that deserves a round of applause. It deserves to be pointed out that at a time long before racial equity was on everyone's lips, Jennifer, as you heard, was already diversifying our staff. She was not taking no for an answer. She was not saying, sorry, we can't find anyone. Instead, she continued to push our team forward. And beyond just checking the box and making the numbers work, Jennifer also focused on mentoring staff, and I have seen it myself, so that they could grow in their own understanding and deepen their own appreciation, knowledge for people that were different. Jennifer's been an innovator, and she sought the data. As you heard, she's gathered insights like the social capital survey, like the Siena poll data, again, before the words racial equity were du jour. She's convened and brought people together, and you could hear the fingerprints of her work and of the Community Foundation's work, extending the life of Neighbors Building Neighbors. keeping us together and focused on bringing people together through the support for the YWCA's program. The All-American Cities Award, I was working for the Community Foundation at that point. What she won't tell you is that she remembered the application that we had made in the 90s. She picked up the phone and reached out to folks all across the community to say that we should focus again on this awesome opportunity, and was really the motive energy for bringing people together so that we could become again an all-American city. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Our chief want is someone who will inspire us to be what we know we could be." And if that's not Jennifer Leonard, I don't know who it is. So if you all would join me in giving her a round of applause. Now, on to our topic for this evening. I want to start by sharing just a few thoughts, and let me set a timer here just to make sure that I don't go over and that we are able to make sure that we have a full opportunity for questions and answers, because these are challenging topics. I think you'll agree, and we certainly want to give them their due. So I want to start by sharing just a couple of quick personal narratives, and then we'll talk a little bit about the implications of those narratives. I'll tell you a little bit about just some observations of what's going on societally and in our community, and then talk a little bit about the Community Foundation and some of how we figure into this approach. I was born and raised here in Rochester, and I'm about as Rochesterian as they come, multiple generations, Rochester through and through. And I want to tell you about when I was 9 years old. Now, my son, Julian, is 9 years old now. And I watch his energy and his growing vigor, his growing curiosity. And it no doubt reminds me of me when I was his age. When I was 9 years old, I was with my mom, and we were walking through downtown Rochester. And as we walked through downtown Rochester, we came upon the mannequins for the Christmas display at Sibley's. And as I looked at those mannequins, I remarked to my mother that I did not recognize any of them because none of them looked like us. And some of you know my mom and have worked with her. I see some heads nodding. And so if you know Irish Spanish, so you know that she grabbed me by the collar, said, "I see it too," and we went home, and she promptly told me to write a letter. And I did that, wrote a letter to the Democrat and Chronicle and to Sibley's, sharing the observation of the lack of diversity in these mannequins in the windows at Sibley's. And my mother, of course, contributed to said letter because I was only 9 years old. But the letter went out, and a few weeks later, she picked me up from school, and we went back downtown. And we came upon that same Sibley's window, and there were caramel-colored mannequins and chocolate-colored mannequins. Imagine if for a 9-year-old kid, that's a heck of a thing. It is something to believe that things can change and that they can be made better because of civic participation and civic engagement and taking action. I want to share with you another story from when I was 9, a few months later. The Rochester Police Department, circa 1990, was having some really difficult times that you all might recall. There was a lot of scandal, a lot of corruption, and there was a lot of police brutality. That time I remember going out for a march with my mom and dad and folks like Raymond Graves and Franklin Florence, and we ended up in the council chambers. Something else for a 9-year-old boy to watch all of this passion and all of this energy about an issue that was critical, our civic life, and to watch, at the time, our city council members offer no response, give no answer. At that point, folks knew I liked to talk a little bit, had a big mouth, and so they said, "Send the kid up there." And I said to the city council something along the lines of, you have the power, and if you don't use it, you're gonna lose it. It's funny because I hear Julian talk now, I say, man, that voice sounds familiar too. Two very different experiences of civic life in Rochester. One where change is possible, things can be made better, people can act. One that is a juxtaposition, bureaucracy, things are slow to move, things do not change. But I think one of the things that was interesting there was watching the foci for change in that moment. In the case of the council, my predisposition was to look at politics. And I had seen a lot of political figures. Many of us have seen political figures, and we often presume that the mechanism to change our communities and to change things is politics. And that makes a lot of sense. Why? Politics has very highly visible objectives. You get elections with clear winners and clear losers most of the time. Politics provides a very easy narrative. There are good guys, the ones we tend to agree with, and the bad guys. And we know that the narrative construct is something that is very, very potent in the American psyche. In fact, politics often manifests itself as a competitive team sport, similar to West Side Story's Sharks and Jets. We organize ourselves into D's and R's and other labels. And of course, the media has accelerated this narrative. Think about the construct, largely a function of seeking a profit. Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, our tribalism laid bare. At the same time, we also see fascinating trends that include the democratization of media. What do I mean by democratization of media? Well, funny things happen when more people get to be the reporters, doesn't it? We know that in millennia ago, the Gutenberg press and its creation, the allowance of more people to engage in canonical text allowed for folks to read it for themselves. And when they did, man, did that create a lot of tumult. We look back at the earlier part of this century, the Arab Spring, largely a function of social media. Because when more people have the opportunity to contribute, the bounds of authority begin to disintegrate. And that gives us a very, very difficult moment with which we have to wrestle. What happens when everybody's a source? When anybody can be a source? When anybody can pull out their phone or make a blog or say what they want to say, especially in an environment that has been stoked and prompted for that kind of tribalism. And then thirdly, we see the disinvestment in local media and investigative journalism. And many of us have watched local media disintegrate before our very eyes. That the revenue models of the past that were dependent on ads is a model that is no longer functional. And the first thing to go has not been the very thing that we need the Fourth Estate to do, to keep us informed, because that is the energy that fuels a democracy. In some sense, Plato's critique of democracy has come to fruition. Everybody remember the Republic? As Plato lays out these forms of government, his ideal aristocracy, the democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. Plato says in the Republic that democracy is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. Spoken like a true aristocrat, huh? I think that one of the challenges, though, is that he misses the possibility that the people, that the demos, can focus on creating public good itself, because his critique centers on the profit-seeking motive that people often display, that because they are so, quote, self-interested, that they lack the capacity, unless properly trained, to focus on the public good. Strikes me that that lack of faith in our humanity undergirds so many of the systems that we currently see in place today. A system that says things like greed is good, when we know that that motive is often the very thing that undermines human progress and human growth. He misses the possibility that the demos can focus on creating public good and is not solely concerned with material acquisition. And he also misses the corrupting weakness that's inherent in his aristocratic approach. Misses the old full that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so in many ways, the Community Foundation enters this picture, enters this foray. We recently were at a conference, the New York Funders Alliance, and heard from a speaker, a guy named Dennis Chin, who spoke with us very interestingly about some observations that he's seen over the course of the last 50 or 60 years in American society, where what we have seen is a trend that transfers assets from the public good to private interests. And insofar as we bankrupt the public good, we undermine our ability to have a strong press. We undermine our ability to care for those that need it the most. The public good is all about how all of us get to progress, how all of us get to grow, how all of us get to realize the best of our humanity. So if we bankrupt that public good, that's kind of a big problem. Would you say so? The Community Foundation is an interesting place, and I've worked in a lot of places. As you heard from my bio, I've had the chance to work in politics proper. So that 9-year-old went off to college, found his way to New York City, and started working in government, and became a bit disillusioned with what felt to me like the efforts to co-conspire to bankrupt the public good in service of the game of playing D's versus R's, often using the language of either progressive values, however one chooses to define those, often at the expense of the people that those values were supposed to lift up. So a few years goes by, I find myself back here in Rochester, and I come across this organization called the Rochester Area Community Foundation. And I was very intrigued by this model. Frankly, at first, a bit dubious. Foundations, philanthropy. Sounds like the aristocracy to me. But what I've come to learn about the Community Foundation and about its importance to this conversation is that for our community, it is a mechanism to transfer assets from private interests back to the public good. We have transferred now $600 million worth of assets, grants of $595 million over the course of our existence to strengthen our community through the power of philanthropy. So one might wonder, then, what is the political obligation of an organization like Rochester Area Community Foundation? And I would say to you that one of the wonderful things about this job is that I find myself a little less concerned about D's and R's in that kind of way, and much more concerned about how we strengthen and reify the public good, regardless of the tribalism that has come to define our nation state. And it seems to me that there's an opportunity for us in rooms like this to start to think beyond that very limiting binary. Because it's the binary itself that is undermining the robust democracy that we should all enjoy, because democracy itself is about people. It's not about parties. It's not about affiliations. It is fundamentally about people. All people, including the people with whom we disagree. It strikes me as I think about the traditions that I draw from, traditions like Martin Luther King and the Kingian tradition. One of Martin's most insightful speeches and blistering critiques of our nation state is when he explored the intimate connection between African American folks and poor white folks. Are you guys familiar with his speaking? That demonstrated the economic interests that were commingled with one another, that had been disrupted by power seeking and capital seeking, that lost track of people. And what I love about Martin Luther King was his insistent focus on people and how people love one another. It also strikes me that that tradition flows through an organization like the Community Foundation. What does this look like in practice for us? Well, just a couple of quick things in my 4 minutes and 44 seconds remaining. First, it looks like work to create a more informed public. And at the Community Foundation, we have started to invest in strengthening the fourth estate in our community. That has looked like making sure that our journalists and the community of journalists in Rochester look more like the people of Rochester, because it's important that the folks that get to tell the story come from and can relate to where the story is made. The Community Foundation is working with the Democrat and Chronicle, with many of our news stations, to diversify the newsrooms with Report for America and other strategies to ensure that we have folks that are able to tell Rochester's entire narrative. And in fact, the Democrat and Chronicle's work revisiting the Rochester narrative was done in partnership and in connection with the work at the foundation. We've also taken the opportunity to focus on solutions-focused journalism, and we are learning more and educating ourselves on that approach. And we are also working, as was mentioned earlier, with ACT Rochester, because an informed public is also at its best when it is a data-informed public. And so we are excited about significant investments in ACT Rochester to share more research and more analysis so that the people of this community can make informed decisions to participate more significantly in our democracy. We are serving as a catalyst for collective action. If you are familiar with our map, can you raise your hand with me? If you're familiar with the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, can you raise your hand? If you are familiar with our MAPI's goal, raise your hand. What is our MAPI's goal? Does anybody know? Ellen? That's correct. Others? Does anybody remember our MAPI's original goal? I appreciate that, and I appreciate the tone in which you said it, McClure, that we were going to attempt to reduce poverty by 50% in 15 years. 50% in 15 years. We are excited because collective action works best when it is connected to the data that we described, and we make choices that are both feasible and that are real. We are excited because we have connected our MAPI with the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute, the national think tank that has been doing work across the country, bringing the nation's leading thinkers on poverty reduction strategies, are deploying that approach right here in Rochester. Our MAPI is adopting the upward mobility framework. And the upward mobility framework refocuses from a number that appears to be very arbitrary to 3 questions around economic success, creating a sense of belonging, and creating a sense of power and autonomy. Because what we know in Rochester is that if we understand the historical arc of our community, many people in this town have been on the downside of power. They have not been blessed with agency and autonomy. And so we can't have a conversation about economic growth and economic thriving and leave people powerless. Those two things don't go together. And we certainly can't have a conversation about power and autonomy if people don't even feel like they belong. That story for the 9-year-old Simeon could have gone a lot different if Sibley had just simply ignored that letter. But when our institutions are responsive to the needs that are lifted up by our community, that is where we find the chance to change. And Lord knows that we need to change. And I think that we can all wrap our arms around each of our obligation and responsibility to hold our institutions accountable for that change, because the fact of the matter is, if we don't, it's not just bad for the folks that are living without, it's not just bad for the folks that are living in ways that are less than sustainable. It's not just bad for the folks that are living in poverty. Because what I can see, what you all know, is that so much of our economic growth in the community, the potential for that economic growth, has been undermined by our inattentiveness to the challenges that are presented when you have so many people that are sitting on the economic sidelines, particularly when that has been meted out by race. That is not sustainable, and it cannot stand. And so, at the foundation, we are excited because our catalytic investments, and they are truly that, investments in the public good, strengthen and reify a stronger public square, which in turn strengthens the demos, the people. And if we have a stronger community, a stronger public good, that bodes well for all of us, particularly for our children. And to me, that's how we end up with a stronger democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Simeon, and thank you again for that lovely tribute to me. I'm not sure how appropriate it was, but it's true. We didn't give you a chance to say anything the other night, and so thank you for that. That was really lovely. Oh, thanks, McCurg. A couple of things. I'm going to give one tribute back and just say that Simeon didn't take credit for what he was describing about the help from was it Brookings to our MAPI. But that is actually part of a strategy, a coalition called the North Star Coalition that came out of his head, was developed in partnership with a consultant named Paul Hippolyte to create a lift all boats scenario in which the federal and state dollars that are pouring into the community, not unlike the period after World War II, that the money, the concept is that the money should go to the people on the economic sidelines. And you heard Simeon talking about that. But specifically, the North Star Coalition has signed on the folks receiving the bulk of that extra money, the county, the city, and the school district, as well as a couple of hundred other people who want to work in concert with it. And the concept is that there's technical assistance provided through Brookings Institute, Urban Institute, the Buffalo Regional Institute, UB, and CGR to help nonprofits like our MAPI address the current challenges of trying to ensure that the benefits of the federal transfer of dollars go predominantly or certainly in disproportionately toward the people who did not benefit after World War II, who were cut out of veterans benefits and other kinds of benefits and subjected to redlining and so forth. So that the idea of the North Star Coalition and its execution, completely simian. While we have other partners we've invited to participate, it's largely funded by the Community Foundation. And we're, any of you know Hinge Neighbors, which is working on the inner loop north to be sure that the city pays attention to the neighbors and what they would like to see happen in when the inner loop north is raised. They're working with the Urban Institute, I believe. And so we're excited to see that kind of thoughtful technical assistance come to the community. And it's entirely because the board asked Simeon what he'd like to work on in his first year. And he said, well, here's an idea. And he had it like a week after they asked him. So it was, instead of taking a year to develop it, it was ready to go because frankly, the ARPA money and other monies were starting to flow and he wanted to get ahead of it. So that's my tribute to you. Let me also say that I mentioned the census in passing. When you talk about people and data, there's nothing more fundamental than the requirement in the Constitution that we enumerate all the people living in this country. During the last census, we faced the threat that people who were in this country but not citizens would not be counted. Of course, they take a lot of public services and also participate in a lot of jobs that we desperately need them to hold. And so the foundation community was among the groups that rose up and protested and paid for legal action. And in the end, that didn't happen, but it still scared a lot of people. So the foundation community also, we pooled our money across America and went to work on learning about the census, engaging lots of national, local, and state and local organizations that work with different immigrant communities and different communities of color, and poured census information into those communities. And it appears that it had some beneficial effect. It was still a census beset by a lot of problems because the last administration had undercut the funding for the census in dreadful ways. And so there'll be another census in a few years, and I encourage you to pay attention, join the local committees that help to plan it and to make sure that it's fair. So I wanted to bring that up because, again, we're talking about injustices and democracy. The census count determines who gets to vote. It determines the size of districts for legislators and for Congress. So it's a fundamental issue that we all can participate in. Otherwise, I agree with everything Simeon said on tribalism, and I certainly have personally experienced the loss of investment in journalism in my household, and we've done what we could to reverse that. But I think in the long run, you're going to see more private efforts like what I've described philanthropy doing, and the private efforts in journalism where WXXI is going to be as big in journalism as the Democrat and Chronicle, bless its diminishing soul, because the model for journalism has collapsed. And whereas the model for charitable support can grow to encompass journalism and is doing so, as Simeon said. So, Joyce, back to you.
Well, what a wonderful menu of things to chew on you've given us, and it's going to take something to digest it. But thank you so much for the richness of your thoughts and your comments and what you are doing, what the Community Foundation is doing. So it's time for some questions. Those of you who have cards, Sandy's coming down the aisle to pick them up. Great. Wonderful. All right, everybody take a breath and get ready for the next piece here. Joni?
Because we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear from everyone who has a question. I hope we can do that. I'm Joni Rubin. I'm going to take questions both from people in the sanctuary and people on Zoom, and I'll try to alternate them and combine them. But I thought that I would start with a version of a question from our democracy committee. And it relates to many of the points that you have both already made, and back to our speaker, Robert Lieberman, who talked about threats to democracy. I don't know if you know that book, For Threats, but he singles out exactly what you're talking about, the precariousness now of a sense of belonging and who counts as a member of the political community. He talks about economic inequality as a threat to democracy, all things that you've mentioned. So the question would be, for each of you, if you could identify one thing that we could do right now to reduce these threats to democracy, what would you suggest? Whatever order you want to go in.
Yeah, so I saw a very, very interesting statistic not too long ago. And a lot of times people have a tendency, and we've seen the rising violence in our community, to associate that kind of violence with poverty, right? There's often a tendency to suggest that communities that are poor tend to have higher levels of violence. And that's actually, statistically, it's actually not all that true. There isn't really a strong correlation with communities' levels of poverty and violence. There's actually a much more statistically significant correlation with income inequality and violence. There's something called the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality. And what you find is that in nations like ours that have a very high Gini coefficient, you see correspondingly high levels of violence. So it strikes to me that a key problem of our time really is income inequality. I'll tell you something else that was interesting. Over the course of the pandemic, we know that there were supports that were given out by the federal government as a way to mitigate some of the pain of the virus and the economic impacts of the virus. Childhood poverty in this country in 2020, 2021 was down 30%. This was a challenge, a problem that we had wrestled with in this country for the better part of the last 30 to 40 years. There were some indications that we were making marginal headway, but then out of nowhere, boom, that distribution of resources had a tremendous impact. It strikes me that it's not that complicated. We know a lot of things that work. The other thing I would say that we know works, Jennifer referenced, as I often think about the period, the war and then post-war period after World War II and the distribution of the New Deal. The reason why, as Jennifer pointed to, we organize ourselves to start the North Star Coalition is because we can read history. And the history is clear that if you were a person, particularly a person that was a white ethnic in this country in the 1920s, you were part of a disparaged class in the United States of America. And while some of the cultural features of that legacy persist, we know that from an economic perspective, many of those gaps have been closed. Why? Because you could get things like the GI Bill, and you could participate in the Works Progress Administration, and you could purchase homes at subsidized rates. We know the things that work. The question at this point is, do we have the will to do them? And I would argue that a lot of people have been obfuscating from what we know works so that we don't just take the steps. And the question for us is to recenter our vision on people. Like I said, not the B's and the R's and all that. So a lot of that is, I find it is a misdirect when really the opportunity for us is to focus on what people actually need and to provide those needs.
Jennifer.
I'll point to the sense of belonging, one of those three factors that are necessary, and say that the inclusion I described can be done in your committees, your organizations, your social lives. Inclusion matters. That sense of being welcome that we found on the social capital survey, that people did not feel welcome. That's something we can each take responsibility for and reach out and include people. It's very powerful.
Great.
Can I just add on just one other quick
Yeah.
thought that I think is also really, really critical. We all know and are watching the levels of inflation increase. And what we've heard is the juxtaposition of the supports that were given with rising levels of inflation, right? So you give out those supports and all of a sudden costs for everything are rising. And economists like Joseph Stiglitz and others will tell you, Thomas Piketty and others will tell you, that is hogwash, right? Because preceding the supports that were given out, we also know that the federal government under prior administrations made some really, I would argue, poor choices about who to distribute resources to and how. Remember what we talked about. If you take money out of the public good and put it into private interests, that has a material costs. Where you find those costs? With schools that don't work, with public parks that are underfunded, with the public square that is essentially bereft of resources. And that leads to the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing now, like increased levels of violence and so on and so forth. When you take that money out, quantitative easing, you may have heard about some of those, approaches, that has a material impact on where we are today. That is actually much more connected to inflation. I just say that because people are throwing that red herring at us. That because of inflation, we need to cut back on the public good and on the resources that people need to be able to sustain themselves. And that would be a grave mistake, I think, for where we are in this moment.
So guess what? I'm going to interpolate my own question because Simeon, you gave me an opening to do this by naming a whole bunch of federal programs, right, from the New Deal period and later. So my question is, how do you think about the relationship between private philanthropy and the federal or state government, which is to say, there might be projects, there have been projects that actually I personally think the government should pay for this. I don't want to put private dollars into this. This is a federal obligation. Healthcare in particular is something that I feel that way about. So how do you think about that coming into this job?
Yeah, so this is actually a really complicated question let's see if I can try to squeeze this into. So one of the challenges of government, what you have to appreciate is that pre-1950, I read an article some time ago where they attempted to chart negative references to government in like newspapers and that kind of thing pre-1950. It was actually relatively rare. People talked about government in terms that were glowing about the role of public service and the responsibilities of government and so on and so forth. It is, to me, not a coincidence that as particularly the federal government starts to act on behalf of people that had been on the margins, particularly through the courts, all of a sudden, government becomes very, very problematic. All of a sudden, we need to get rid of it. It's too big. And that, of course, crystallizes by the time you get to the 1980s. What that has meant for us is that the ability for us to fund the public good has become somewhat constricted. Philanthropy, I think, has played a very important role. Particularly, I want to make a distinction because there's a tendency to paint in very broad brushes about philanthropy. I've been reading some work from folks like her name, first name escaped me, Hastings Saunders is her last name. Public virtue, private. Forgive me for blanking on the title. It's been a longish kind of weekend and day. But at any rate, paints with a very broad brush about philanthropy. Philanthropy can have a downside. There's no doubt about it. We have to be honest about that. But it's also the case that community-oriented philanthropy, as is the style of community foundations, helps to put resources back into the public good in a way that's palatable for folks that they can wrap their heads around. In part because we have to acknowledge that there has been corruption in government. I mean, that is an actual truth, right? And it's part of the reason why there's often misgivings about putting more resources into government itself. This is like, it's a very complicated topic. It's one I actually do like to talk about. And if anybody ever wants to, grab a beverage and have a conversation about it, I'm definitely your guy to
Okay,
talk more
great.
deeply about it.
Okay, great. I'm going to take this question from the chat and maybe throw it to Jennifer first. Please comment on the ability of the Rochester community to determine its own future without a reliance on the outcomes at the federal or state level. That is, as democracy erodes, this assumes that democracy is eroding at the federal and state levels. How can we strengthen democracy at our local level? Do we have to then act locally?
I think we need to act locally regardless of what's going on with the federal government and the states, because we need to have the strength to make it through whatever is going on. I believe that if we strengthen ourselves economically in a way that includes people, so we are investing in businesses that are small businesses run by people, owned by people of color. We're helping provide coaching supports for them. We helped start Kiva Rochester, which gives crowdsourced loans and just made its $1,000,000th loan to, again, city-owned businesses in the city and so forth. Done on a larger scale, if more people are participating in our economy, we will be better off as a region to determine our own future. So I think it's pretty straightforward.
So we have a bunch of questions that ask about what's worked. I think you've addressed some of that in your comments, but some of our question askers are concerned about what were the most effective initiatives in the past, and also how you hold partners accountable for what this writer calls real progress toward delivering tangible outcomes. So I guess it's a two-part question for me. What would you single out from among the initiatives you've mentioned that have really worked? And then someone else asked about the structures that needed to be in place to make those initiatives work. And then when things are not working so well, maybe how do you hold partners accountable, get those things working, decide to abandon them? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Sydney, did you want to start?
Sure. So number one, some things that I think are interesting. I think one really good example of something that I think has worked very well in Rochester is the CASH program. And folks might be familiar with CASH. That was run out of Empire Justice. And the way that CASH basically worked is that it sought to close the knowledge gap that a lot of families had about the kinds of things for which they are eligible, some of the credits and returns for which they are eligible. And we hear many, many stories of families that have been able to sustain themselves because of being able to take advantage of those credits. We're actually today happy to share that the former director of CASH, Berta Rivera, has actually joined our team. And we're really excited to have her on board. Another example of something that I think is working really well here in town is Renew, the Rochester Energy and Weatherization program. Renew is a effort that allows for low-income Rochesterians to have their homes renovated, particularly in relation to energy improvements, save those families money, as well as improvements for the indoor climate in the home. Somebody said health is wealth, and it's certainly the case that many families that just can't make those large kinds of home improvements experience significant declines in health that undermine their economic potential and have a generational effect, right? Particularly in homes that are beset with lead and other molds and allergens and so on and so forth. And so the remediations that Renew is making has been, significantly beneficial. Over 400 homes engaged. Renew has also leveraged the initial $1 million that started the program with restitution from the Attorney General into $6 million of coordinated funding in this space. And what's interesting is where that restitution came from. It was actually the largest air polluting company in the country. So Renew actually started with an act of what? Justice. Isn't that interesting? And so by leveraging justice, it provided those resources that we've been able to expand into the public good. And it seems to me that that's a model that's working well. Jennifer, I'll let you go, and then I can talk a little bit about how we evaluate and so on and so forth.
Oh, perfect. And I might add, thanks to Renew, 600 fewer tons of carbon dioxide entered our local air.
That's right.
Not bad, huh? I want to salute a program that existed when I came to town. My predecessor started it with Ford Foundation money. It's called the Early Childhood Development Initiative. And I see you nodding because so many people have been touched by this, but were we not to have that initiative, our educational problems in the city would be far worse because we actually are bringing children to kindergarten in the city schools who have had a chance to be, have developmentally outstanding education. That is at the top level nationally, especially compared, for example, to childcare centers in suburban areas. Our urban childcare centers perform extremely well, and they do that because we have a low stakes testing program that evaluates the centers, it trains the teachers, it gives the teachers assessments and then gives them the feedback on how they can improve in the areas that they're working on. And that process of regular annual reporting called RECAP, Rochester Early Childhood Assessment Partnership, has been going since the early 90s. And initially, children's performance has shot way up. What we saw then was they leveled out at a high rate, but they leveled out partly because poverty in Rochester was rising sharply at the same time. But this program helps keep up with that. And we have remarkable resources in early childhood education because of a coordinated effort that was started at the Community Foundation. It's now housed at Children's Institute and continues to train, assess, report, train, assess, report. So, Simeon.
So I think we have time. I'm going to take a couple more questions because we things got put, the timeline got pushed toward going a little bit later. So, and then and there are lots of questions on the chat. I'm only going to take one. But maybe you can just respond briefly. And it is this. So this is a big one, but a brief answer. Maybe the answer is a yes or no answer. Is it possible that a weakness of representational democracy is slippage between the ideals and aspirations of the public and those representing the public? Once elected, many go on to act on a more personal agenda, getting reelected, like I'm adding that, that is often at odds with public needs, hence slippage. Maybe the answer to that is just yes. But could you reflect just for a minute about the difference between the public's ideals and what politicians actually do? I think that's the question.
Yeah, so yes, there is slippage. And I think it's in part because of how elections and campaigns are financed. It strikes me that it's been one of the most intractable issues for us to engage, but one of the most necessary. And it strikes me that the extent to which the agenda is driven by interests in a lot of ways does end up undermining the public. And I think we have to be candid and honest about that. I do have some ideas around, some things that we can do by strengthening the public good, but there's not enough time for that tonight, so.
Okay. And then we have a couple of questions about how we, the public and our audience tonight, can find out more about what you are doing. And I'm sure part of the answer is to go to your website. I'm a big Googler, so I'll just say to whoever asks that, just Google, right? Rochester Area Community Foundation, and I know you'll find your website. But are there ways that people or contacts that people can make to find out about specific initiatives? The census was something that interested the person who wrote this question, or is that all on the website?
The website is very comprehensive, but I'm not sure that you can find out about the census on there. And our program officer who worked on the census program has left, and I am retiring in 2 weeks. So it's not so easy to find out about the census program. Simeon, do you have a recommendation?
And folks can always feel free to reach out and call. That's number one. Also, we have invested heavily. We have a new colleague that's working on social media, and that has become a great place to hear about contemporary things that are happening at the Community Foundation. And then we have a biennial report that's coming out in a couple of weeks that will also talk about the work that we've done over the last 2 years.
Okay, so do you have a way to sign up for that social media?
Yes, we have a couple of different handles that you can actually find if you go to the website. So
right,
at the bottom are links to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
So racf.org
is the website.
racf.org.
And it's like RACF 100, RACF for Change. There's a couple of different handles.
Great. Okay. I just want to say that we have many comments in the chat about how great this program has been. We had 42 people on Zoom at the high point.
Nice.
Okay. And you all came out, which I want to express my gratitude for. And I want to thank our speakers and turn it back to Joyce.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Simeon. You have really, this has been inspiring, and it's so enlightening and inspiring, and we wish you the very best. Simeon, as you take over, we know that they couldn't have chosen better. And Jennifer, the best of luck to you. In our regards to David.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming. I think that we will find many conversations, and maybe we will find ways within Temple Sinai to continue conversations about our democracy online and in person.